In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at the vector texture creation function. Now this tool can be used to create all different types of textures, including the wavy texture that you can see on screen. We can then take these vectors, toolpath them to create a nice texture wall panel, or we can use the tool to create vectors that could then be used to create a faux wood grain effect. Now we are going to follow up this tutorial with two different videos, both based around toolpathing to get different styles out of the vectors that we create, and those will both be linked in the related video section in the browser. But now we're going to take a look at the tool itself and all the different parameters that the tool has to enable us to create the different type of textures. So let's start by opening a new copy of the software, and we're going to create a new file. And we're going to be creating a single-sided job, so specify that here. We're going to specify a width of 24 inches, a height of 12 inches, and 3/4 of an inch in thickness. We're going to be using inches for the units in this tutorial. And the Z0 position we're going to specify at the material surface. We're going to be using the XY date and position in the lower left. And after I've specified all these options, I'm just going to press OK to accept those. Now the vector texture creation function can be found here underneath the Create Vectors section in the Drawing tab, and it's denoted by the waves inside a circle icon. Now if we just click on that, that will take us through to the Create Vector Texture form. And from here we can see all the options available to us. So what we'll do to start with is we'll just run through each of the options available, and I'll just explain exactly what each one of these will do. So the first one is the angle. Now this is going to be the angle at which the waves are created in the software, and we can choose to specify these in this box here, so an explicit value, and you'll also see that that has then moved this slider. So we can use this slider as well to specify an angle as well. Now I'm just going to leave this at 0 so that our waves will run from left to right along the horizontal. Then we've got the line spacing. Now this is the spacing in between each of the waves that is created by the tool. Now at the moment these are 0.35 of an inch spaced apart. Now I'm just going to choose a nice round number like 1 inch to begin with, just to show you what this is like. And underneath this option we have this variation slider. Now this variation slider enables us to vary the distance in between each of the vectors that is created by this tool, dependent on where this slider is within this range here. Now if it's at the very far left like it is now, that means no variation is going to occur, and it's just going to create all the vectors with an equal 1 inch spacing. Now the further I take this up the slider, the software will randomize the maximum spacing in between each of the vectors created, dependent on how far we move this slider up and down this range here. The next options available to us are the wave parameters. Now this is where we can specify the amplitude and the wavelength of each of the vectors that will be created by this tool. The first being amplitude, where we can specify the distance between the top and the bottom, or the peak and the trough of each of the waves created. It is currently set at 1.5 inches. We can use this slider to change that value. However, I'm just going to type in an exact value of 1 inch there. The next option available to us is the wavelength. Now this is the overall distance to create a complete wave from top flowing down and through to the bottom. Now this is currently set to 6 inches. Now this is a good value, so I'm just going to keep that at 6, but we can also use this slider again to specify a value. I'm just going to type in the value 6 there. The next option is the noise parameter. Now this enables us to add noise, as you can see, which is denoted by the icon here. We can add noise to the vectors. Now if it's all the way down to the far left, we're going to get a nice smooth curve. However, the further up the range slider we go, the more variation that these waves will have. So to begin with, I'm just going to move the slider down to the far left so we have no noise whatsoever. We're just going to get a nice smooth curve. And the last option that is presented to us is where we would actually like to place the vectors once they are created. Now if we do not check this checkbox here, they will be created on the selected layer that you have in your layer list here, which currently is layer 1. Now for this demonstration, I'm just going to place these vectors on a separate layer, and I call that layer textures. So we can now go ahead and press the preview button to see what vectors we actually created using the parameters above. So as you can see, we have vectors of a nice smooth curve that have an amplitude of about 1 inch, and also they have 1 inch spaced apart as well, with a wavelength reoccurring every 6 inches as we specified here, and no noise whatsoever. So what we're going to do now is just going to change a few of these parameters just so you can see visually what each one of these is doing. So if I just change that to 30 degrees and just press preview, you see that all the waves now created on a 30-degree angle. Can even create them at 60, like so. Just place that back down to 0. And you can even use the slider to change the angle as well, like so. And then with the line spacing, so we can change the max line spacing to be, let's say, 3 inches, like so. So now we've got a huge space in between each of these vectors that are created. Or we can try a really small spacing, like 0.1 of an inch, like so. So now we have a real tight formation of each of the vectors that are created. So I'll just change that back to 1 inch. And next I will show you the variation. So at the moment we have an exact spacing of 1 inch in between each of the vectors that are created. But if I just move this slider to about 50% and preview, you'll see that we're starting to get some difference in the spacing. Now if I press preview again, you'll see that that changes every time, so you'll never get the same pattern twice. Now if I move that up to the far right, you'll see that now we've introduced maximum spacing and we're getting some real randomness in between each line that's created using the tool. So I'll just put that back down to the far left again. Next, we can have a play around with the actual wave parameters. So we'll start by modifying the amplitude. So we could go for something larger, so we can have a greater distance between the peak and trough of that wave. So we could go for 4 inches. So let's just preview that. Or we could go for something even smaller. So we could go for ½ inch, for instance. So we could change that. So you can see there's just a very slight, subtle wave that goes across the screen there. Or we can change the actual wavelength. So we could make these smaller. So we can make these waves complete over only just 1 inch. So if we just press preview, so you see we get a nice tight packed wave there with 1 inch in between each of the peaks or troughs. Or we could make this even greater, so we could go for 18 inches. So we can only just about get one complete wave over the distance of 24 inches of our work area. Or we could even go for something even greater than our work area, so we don't even get one complete wave going across our workspace. So we could go for something like 30 inches, like so. So if I revert these to the values that we were using before, so that was 1 inch for the amplitude and 6 inches for the wavelength, we'll take a look now at adding some noise to these vectors. So if I just move this slider up to around 50% and just click preview, you see that we started now to add some noise to each one of these vectors. And you see that each of the vectors is still sticking within the maximum spacing that we specified up here. And if I increase the noise, you'll see that now that will start to take advantage of that space even more. So if I click the preview, you'll see that now it's really utilizing that maximum spacing, and it is restricted by that maximum spacing that we specify. So if I reduced that maximum spacing to, let's say, 0.2 of an inch, you'll notice that you'll see each of the lines is still packed within the maximum spacing constraints. So now we've looked at all the options, I'm just going to reset this back down to no noise. So if we just preview that, and the maximum spacing of 1 inch, like so. If we're happy with the vectors that we have created, we can press OK, and that will then create the vectors on the layer that we specified here, called textures. If we are not happy with the vectors for whatever reason, or we don't want to create those vectors anymore, we can simply press cancel. That will get rid of the vectors and there'll be no new layer that's created. I'm happy with these vectors, so I'm going to simply press OK. As you'll see that those are now on screen. And if we go to the Layers Manager, you'll see that we've got a new layer called Textures, and they have vectors on them as denoted by the icon here. Now I can simply turn that on off just to demonstrate the vectors are on that layer. So I'm going to go ahead and create some new vectors now. So I'm just going to go and hide the layer vectors. I'm just going to go and select layer 1. And I'm going to show you now how we can create vectors within a vector boundary. So if I just quickly sketch out a random vector shape like so, and click apply and close, and as long as this is selected, when I go into the vector texture form, that will then use that vector as a boundary for me to create a texture inside of. So if I just click on preview, you'll see that that texture that we have created from the parameters here is now constrained within the vector boundary. Now I can just quickly edit this to make this a slightly different texture. So if I just put that as 0.3 in max spacing and then give this a wavelength of say 3 inches, like so, just so we get a different vector texture there. And I'm just going to place this on the active layer, which is going to be layer 1. So I'm going to deselect the place vectors on layer textures, and I'm just going to press OK, and you'll see that now that those are on layer 1. Now the other thing that I'm going to show you is also the fact that as long as we don't edit these vectors using various other tools within the software, we can actually go back into the vector texture creation form, and all the parameters that we use to create these vectors will be placed in them. So we can actually make edits to this exact texture. So if I just highlight those and go back into the vector texture form, you'll see that all these parameters are the ones that we used to create this texture in the first place. So we can now go ahead, make any changes we would like to these vectors, press OK, and that will then change those vectors that were on the layer textures. So let's imagine for a moment that we're going to create a large textured wall panel, but we don't have the machine bed available, nor do we have the material available to cut it in one go. So what we'd have to do is we'd have to divide that job up into multiple tiles. Now each tile is going to have to flow its pattern from one tile into the next smoothly, so that overall it gives the effect of just being one piece. Now there are two different options for us to go ahead and do that. We can either create a tileable texture, which would be like the one that's on screen at the moment. Now a tileable texture is one that flows horizontally or vertically, so the angle must be either 0 degrees for horizontal or 90 degrees for vertical, and the wavelength itself must be divisible into the width of the tile that we're creating. So our tile at the moment has a width of 24 inches and we have a wavelength of 6. So that divides into 24 4 times, so that's fine. And that would basically mean that we could just create multiples of the same tile, and we could be able to stack them left to right, top to bottom, and the pattern would flow equally and smoothly into each one. The other option would be to create the job at the size of the textured wall panel that we actually desire, and then we'd have to divide that up into multiple tiles itself. Now we can either do that manually using the tools within the software, or we can use the toolpath tiling manager to do that for us. And there is a video all about toolpath tiling, which I will link to in the related videos section in the tutorial browser. Now I'm just going to press cancel, as I don't want to make any changes to my vectors, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to demonstrate that these vectors that we have created are in fact tileable. So first of all, I'm just going to select them and select them again, which is going to put them into transform mode. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit. I'm going to grab hold of a node like so. I'm going to hold the control key down, which means it's going to create me a copy over to wherever I let go of the mouse pointer. I'm going to wait for this point on the mouse pointer to turn into this icon here, just let you know when, there, which means it's going to join it to the nearest node. So if I let go, that's now joined them up perfectly, as you can see, node to node from one selection to another. And you see that the pattern does flow from left to right. Now to demonstrate that the pattern actually flows from top to bottom as well. So I've just dragged the box over both vector selections. Going to select them again to put it into transform mode. I'm going to drag, using the control key again, up to the top. And I'm just going to align them, and it should jump into place. There we go, like so. And you'll see that the pattern flows from left to right and top to bottom. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete all the extra vectors that I don't need, like so. And I'm going to hit F on the keyboard to zoom to fit. Now the last thing I'm going to show you is 4 different examples which we're going to create with the vector texture tool, and we're going to use those and set them up in such a way which we can toolpath them later in the 2 other toolpathing videos which follow on to this tutorial. So first of all, I'm just going to go ahead and delete these vectors here and delete this layer and switch on that layer and delete those vectors as well. And what we're going to do is we're going to set this job up so that we can create perfect tiles for our textured wall panel. So I'm going to rename layer 1. I'm going to call this the cutout. As what we're going to do is we're going to create a larger job. So we're going to add an extra inch onto our job in both the width and in the height. And we're going to then create the cutout pass to be the exact size of the tile that we want. Now the reason why we're going to do that is we're basically going to cut the full texture in the 25 by 13 inch tile, and we're going to cut it back to ensure that we've got a full cut of the tool within that 24 by 12 tile. So let's just create a rectangle at 24 by 12. And let's just create that, and that's just come in there, but I can hit either F9 on the keyboard, or we can come to the Align Selected Objects tool. Now I'm just going to quickly resize my job before I do that. I'm going to change that to 25 inches in width, 13 inches in Y. Just press OK to accept that. Grab and select my vector that I've just created, and I'm going to hit F9 on the keyboard, and that's now centered that to my work area. Now we can also hit F, or we can hit this button here, and that will then zoom to our job area. So let's move on and create the first lot of our 4 textures that we're going to create. So let's go back into the vector texture form. Now before creating any vector textures, we should really think about how we actually want to toolpath these when it comes to it. Now the reason we want to think about it now is because the line spacing is important to the actual text that we're going to get once we've toolpathed it. Now if we have a line spacing that is too large, and we're going to be using, so let's say, an 1/2 inch V-bit tool or ball nose, the cutting area of that on either side of the vector line is going to be the radius, so that would be 1/4 inch. So if you imagine the max spacing that we'd really want for a 1/2 inch tool would be 1/2 inch, because we want each line that is spaced 1/2 inch apart to be cut into 1/4 inch on each side by that single tool, if the tool is travelling along that vector whilst toolpathing. So it's always good to think about that first before we end up with flat spots when we come to preview the toolpaths that we have created, and it's all down to the line spacing that we chose earlier on. So I'm going to choose a line spacing of 0.3 inch, so I'm going to imagine I'm using quite a large ball nose or V-bit tool. And then I'm going to keep the amplitude at 1 inch, the wavelength at 6 inches, no noise, and I'm just going to place this on a layer called Wave. Let's just preview that, and I'm okay with those. Let's press OK, and let's turn the visibility off of that layer, like so, and select the cutout layer to be our primary active one. And let's go ahead and create the second lot of vectors. So this time I'm going to choose an angle of 45 degrees, and I'm going to choose a slightly larger max spacing of 0.35. Then I'm going to increase the amplitude to 1.5 inches. I'm going to keep the wavelength at 6. I'm just going to preview those, and I'm going to call this step. Now you can see that the vectors do actually form like a sort of step pattern in that texture. So I'm just going to go ahead and press OK to accept those. I'm going to do the same again. It's going to turn off that layer, going to make the cutout the active one, and then I'm going to go ahead and create my next lot of vectors. So let's go back into the vector texture tool, and this time let's create something a little bit more different. So let's go for an angle of 60 degrees. Let's go for a slightly bigger max spacing of 0.4. Let's go for an amplitude of 8 inches, and let's go for a wavelength of 16, and let's just quickly preview that. And this time let's just add in some variation to the line spacing so we get something a bit more different to play with when we come to toolpathing this. So let's just go for something that looks like that. So let's press OK. Now first, before we do that, let's just call this layer swirl. So swirl, and let's press OK, and let's just turn off that layer, make the cutout the active one, and let's create our last lot of vectors. Now for this last lot of vectors, I want to create something a little different. What I aim to do once I've toolpathed them is to get like a faux wood grain effect. So for this, I want to use a very low angle of around about 2 degrees. I want quite a tight line spacing to represent like the tight wood grain effect that you get. So I'm going to make that 0.15 of an inch. I'm going to have variation up quite high around about here, but we can adjust that once we've previewed that. I'm going to have a really small amplitude, so I'm going to choose 1/10 of an inch, and I want quite a long wavelength, one that's nearly the entire length of the tile itself. So I'm going to choose 18 inches there. And I want the noise to be roughly around about there, but we can play around with that once we've previewed it. So yeah, that looks quite good for a wood grain effect as vectors go, and when we go to toolpath these in the related videos, then you'll soon see the effect that outcomes from these. So I definitely recommend that you watch these. So as I'm happy with that, I'm actually going to keep those. I'm going to call this wood grain, like so, and I'm going to press OK to keep those. Now I'm going to go ahead and save a copy of our work so that we can refer back to this when it comes to the toolpathing videos. So I'm just going to go down to my tutorials folder, and I'm going to find vector textures, and I'm going to save my work. I'm just going to call this vector underscore textures underscore drawing, like so. I'm just going to put a capital T there, and that's it. So we can load this file back up when we use them in the two toolpath videos, which do follow after this, and you'll find those again, as I say, in the related videos. Now there is one last thing that I do want to talk to you about, and that is the makeup of these actual vectors themselves. So if I just go to my layer list and I just turn off the wood grain and I turn back on the wave list, as these will be the most simple to talk about, you'll notice that at first that they're all highlighted in a solid pink colour, which means basically that all these vectors are grouped together. And we can ungroup those by pressing the letter U on the keyboard, like so, and now you'll see that they're now all in a dashed pink line, which means that they are now individual vectors, as you can see. So I can go ahead and select different vectors in my work area, as you can see. Now this isn't the actual thing that I wanted to talk about. The actual thing I wanted to talk about was the actual makeup of these individual vectors. Now we can see this if I click N on the keyboard, which will take me into node editing. Or I can click this button here under the Edit Objects form, which is the node editing mode, and now you'll see that all the nodes of the line are now visible. Now at the moment we just have a very dark, chunky black line, but if we zoom in, you'll see that these are actually all different nodes, and they're all line segments. So these curves are actually all made out of thousands of tiny, tiny little lines. Now this won't be a problem for machining, as any curves that normally come out like this in the software will usually be broken up into thousands of tiny little line segments in the actual toolpath code itself. So we won't see any difference in quality from machining these as they are, but in case you wanted to make these easier for editing, what we can do is we can actually transform these into Bezier curves to make them a lot easier to edit manually ourselves. Now how we do this, if I just come out of node editing mode and just go back into the normal selection mode, like so, I can select this line here, this vector, and I can go to Fit Curves to Selected Vectors, which is this icon here. If we just click that, and you see that it gives us the option to assign a fitting type, and we want to take that to the Bezier curves. We want to have a low tolerance. Now I'm going to take off keep sharp corners there, and I do want to replace the selected vectors. And if we just preview that, you can see that that now is a very simple vector that we can now manipulate and edit a lot easier than we could have done previously. But as I say, this won't make any difference to the actual toolpathing quality itself. So I'm going to leave mine as they are. So that's it for this tutorial. Please join us again in the related videos for the toolpathing. That's going to be the 2D toolpaths and the 2.5D and 3D toolpaths in two separate tutorials. Thank you for watching.